In brief, today's a homecoming of sorts, as Paul is a native of Glendale and is a descendant of Armenian parents from Kharpert, the Kharpert region of historic Armenia. He's a proud graduate of the University of Southern California and earned an MBA from Harvard University after serving as a naval officer in World War II. Paul Ignatius served for 8 years in the presidential administrations of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, first as an Assistant Secretary of the Army, then as Undersecretary of the Army and Assistant Secretary of Defense, and finally in 1967 as Secretary of the Navy. Following his government service, he was president of the Washington Post news organization for 2 years and president of the Air Transport Association for 15 years. He's the recipient of many honors, including the Army Distinguished Civilian Service Award, the Navy Distinguished Public Service Award, and the Department of Defense Distinguished Public Service Award. Paul is the author of 2 memoirs, Now I Know in Part, which we'll be talking about today, and On Board, My Life in the Navy, Government and Business, which was published by the Naval Institute Press in 2006. Now I Know in Part is a substantially revised and expanded edition of a memoir that was first published privately in the year 2000. This second edition was issued in late 2011 by Nasser's Armenian Heritage Press. And the book will be available for purchase and signing by the author after the presentation. There's stacks of books in the back there. And I think you'll find this memoir provides a valuable and important window into Armenian American life. I just want to mention briefly that Paul has a strong relationship with the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, where he's supported the organization as a member of its honorary board and has been involved since the founding. He also has a long relationship with NAASR, where he was the keynote speaker for the 50th anniversary celebration in 2006, first time I met Paul. And the same year he was a traveler along with his son Adi and daughter Sarah on a NAASR Armenian Heritage Tour of Historic Armenia in the Republic of Armenia. He also has an interesting relationship with the Ararat Speech Museum, and that his grandmother's dress is one of the items in their collection. Did I get that right? Okay. Thank you very much for coming. Let's please welcome Paul Ignatius. Paul, would you
Thank you very much. I don't have to tell you that it's a pleasure for me to be here in Glendale for a number of reasons. First, I did grow up here in 1920. I was born in Glendale and went to public schools. We lived just a few miles from here on Columbus Road, just off Kenneth Road. My grandfather, who came from Agan and who had gone to Euphrates College in Kharpert, left Historic Armenia in 1892 because he had written some poetry that had forbidden words in it, such as freedom and liberty, and he got into deep trouble with the Ottoman authorities. His family, who were distributors of British cotton goods in the Middle East, packed him off to Manchester, England, along with 2 tiny babies, one of whom was my mother. And he lived in Manchester for about 20 years and then decided to come to California. He made a trip here and liked it, liked the weather. Sunny California, which we're enjoying today. I hope it isn't global warming that's causing this, but at any rate, it's quite delightful, isn't it? At any rate, he bought a lot of property just south of where we are, near Forest Lawn, in a place that was then called Tropico, that became part of Glendale. This was in 1911. He built a big house there with a tennis court, and he came as a fairly wealthy man, but managed to lose what he had very quickly through some really very bad investments. Whether he was naive or taken advantage of, I don't know. At any rate, he had this big house and a Cadillac automobile, very little money after these terrible investments, and a soap factory, of all things. Why he bought a soap factory, I have no idea. But at the age of 55 or 56, he had to go back to manage this soap factory, and his sons, there were several of them, went to work and helped him with it. And so lo and behold, the California Soap Company near the train station, it was down in that area of Los Angeles, made industrial soaps and made one kind of soap that you could use in your dishwasher, or more particularly in your washing machine. In this book, there's a chapter on doing the wash with my grandfather's semi-made soap. In our house, for reasons even to this day I don't fully understand, neither my mother nor my sister did the wash. My brother and I did the wash. Now, the reason that was given was that these are in the Depression years, and my sister was really quite an accomplished pianist. And piano lessons cost a lot of money. I suppose in those days it might only have been a couple of dollars or so per lesson, but that was a lot of money. I mean, to put this in perspective, if you could afford to go to a first-run movie at the Alex Theater, you could go and it cost 40 cents. But most of us didn't have 40 cents, but you could go to another theater called the Roxy, where you could see a double feature for only 15. That was the kind of price there. And Bob's Big Boy Hamburger, which was started by Bob Wyan, who went to Glendale High School and took a course in cooking so he would have something to do in those Depression years, had a vision one day. He woke up in the morning and said, "Why don't we slice the bun in two?" And that was the origin of the double-decker Bob's Big Boy Hamburger. He started right down Colorado Street with six stools, and then grew and eventually became, I believe, the mayor of Glendale. Now, this was before the Armenians came. When I went to Hoover High School, I think the only other Armenian kids at Hoover High School were my brother and my sister. Hard to believe today, because I don't know, but I would guess maybe half of the students at Hoover are from Armenian homes. That wasn't true then. So we grew up with many Armenian friends of my family. I was baptized at the Armenian church on Adams Boulevard in Los Angeles by Badveli Erechian. My father was a great supporter of the church, as long as he didn't have to go to church every Sunday. And if they needed money, he helped to raise money for it. And he was you might say, a pillar of the church in some ways, but seldom by attendance. So as a result, we didn't go. We had a maid until the Depression hit, who was a very, very strict Lutheran. And she told my brother and me one morning that we were going to go down below the surface of the earth with the devil because we didn't. She went to church Wednesday night as well as on Sunday. So we've got lots of lectures from her. Well, Glendale is so different today, and the biggest difference of all is this large number of Armenian people. On Thursday, just several days ago, I was asked by the Armenian General Counsel, Grigor Bovanesyan, if I would speak to the Consul General Corps here in the Southern California area. There are 80 countries represented there, some well-known large countries, Sweden, Germany, and some really very small places, the African continent and elsewhere. But the most wonderful thing about the event, well, after my speech, but the most wonderful thing after that was the Armenian lunch that was served. And I must say, these diplomats piled food on their plate. I mean, the dolmas were gone even before I got to the table, and there was this wonderful, they had, what is patlıcan, is that the eggplant?
Yes.
Small ones, very small, with onions and a lot of olive. God, it was unbelievable. And I couldn't eat too much because I had to speak after lunch, and I didn't want to get too full. Let me say just a word about the three organizations that have earlier been identified as sponsors of this event today. My father, whose name was Hofstad Ignatius, and my grandfather's name, by the way, was Avadis Matios Jamgochan, great Armenian name. My father became a kind of leader of the Armenian community in Los Angeles, and all the events I mentioned at church, and he and my mother started something called the Armenian Allied Arts Association that I think is still in existence.
Yes, yeah.
And the Eskegian Museum and home out in the valley was started by several people, including my father. There's a plaque at the museum that has his name on it. And then, as was mentioned earlier, my grandmother had this really wonderful wedding dress. It was a sort of kind of peacock blue color with gold thread. It was made in Constantinople by hand, and she was married in that. And there's in the book, if you look at the book, there's a picture of my sister wearing that dress when my grandfather's family were all gone. We donated that dress to the museum. So I have, through my family, a connection with that. Secondly, NAASR in Boston really has a mission that I think is terribly important for anyone of Armenian heritage, and that is to, initially when they first established themselves about 55 years ago, was to raise funds to establish a chair of Armenian studies at Harvard University. And my father, again, a personal reference here, was one of the people who worked to raise those monies in order to establish this Armenian chair at a prestigious American university. NAASR does a lot of things to keep alive the historic context of this ancient nation and also contemporary issues that involve the Republic of Armenia and Armenians in the diaspora in many parts of the world. I was lucky enough in 2006 to make a trip to both the Republic of Armenia and to Historic Armenia, sponsored by NAASR. And it was absolutely wonderful. I had never been to that part of the world. Oddly enough, my wife, Nancy, who is here, had been to Armenia before I had. She went when it was still part of the Soviet Union. She went over with a group from the Washington National Cathedral that wanted to talk about religious issues in a largely, at least officially, irreligious Soviet Union. I mean, if you wanted to get somewhere in the Communist Party, you didn't want to go to church too often. Typically, the people who went to church were old ladies, the babushkas who had shawls over their heads and kind of snuck in. But this trip was to talk about the Russian Orthodox Church. But at any rate, the people on the trip were given an option after being in Moscow and elsewhere in the Soviet Union to travel either to Armenia or to Georgia. And Nan chose to go to Armenia, and the excitement she found and communicated to me and to the members of our family was that in a generally dour, depressive, communist state, she found a lot of liveliness and friendliness and openness in Yerevan. And there was something of that spirit of the Armenian people, the hospitality, the friendship, and so forth, that managed to penetrate the strictures of the communist regime. And so she'd gone there. I'd never been there. One of my sons, David, the oldest of our 4 kids, is a journalist, and he had made 1 or more trips there. And our younger son, Adi, was the Wall Street Journal's bureau chief in Moscow, and he had hoped to get down to Armenia during his stay there, but wasn't able to. At any rate, he went along, Adi and my daughter Sarah, and it was a great experience. We found the Republic of Armenia obviously inspiring, lots of problems, political problems. There's a lot of corruption that is partly a holdover from the communist days. They're trying to deal with that. But they're smart people. They have a university sponsored by the University of California that awards graduate degrees. There's an awful lot of building. You know, you could say that the national bird of Armenia is the building crane. I mean, there's so many of them around Yerevan. The economy is sort of so-so. An Armenian economist at a convention of economic professors was asked if you had to describe the Armenian economy in 1 word, what would you say? He said, good. He said, well, what if you had to describe it in 2 words? Not good. And I think that ambiguity in the economy is probably, there's some good and there's some not good, but they're trying. And in the long run, in the long run, it's really the quality of people that make an economy go. I mean, you can talk all you want about theory, but Steve Jobs was somebody who knew something when he saw it. It's really deviated from my talk a little bit, but the mouse, the computer mouse, was invented by Xerox, but they didn't know what to do with it. But Steve Jobs saw that mouse, and it just clicked. He knew exactly what to do with it. And Nokia, which led the world in cell phones, is you can't give away Nokia stock today. It's under $5, but Apple stock is over $400. I wish I owned some. At any rate, the genius of the people is the point I'm making, and the Armenians certainly have an abundance of talented, smart, dedicated people. The third of the organizations today is the University of Southern California. I am really honored to call myself a friend of Professor Dekmedjian. I've known him for a number of years. How he manages to do all he does, teaching one of the most popular courses at the university, authoring 5 or 6 or 7 books, and running the Institute of Armenian Studies is a full plate for anyone, but he manages somehow to keep all of those balls in the air. And it's the Armenian Institute is important. It's growing in importance, and it's done a number of significant things in its 8 or 9 year history. My family has a really rather deep connection with USC. I graduated from there. My brother went there before transferring to Stanford Medical School, and my mother went to USC right around 1918, before she was married in 1919. She started around 1915. And one of the original buildings at USC was called the Music School Annex. And it was a kind of a bungalow house with a lot of pianos where musical students would go to practice. And I had a job as a student at $40 a month, which is big money. And but I didn't play the piano like my mother did. I dusted the piano. And I was the janitor in the music building at $40 a month. And the woman who presided over this building remembered my mother from a long time ago. Well, those are the three organizations. They're all worthwhile. And the final thing I want to say about this is that if any of you choose to buy this book, I don't get anything from it. I told the people at NAASR that any income from the book should go to them. So I thought that was a way that I could follow in my father's footsteps, who would be surprised if he saw me here today, because when I grew up, I have to confess, I was much more interested in playing games and playing tennis and becoming president of the student body and a whole lot of things like that. And Armenian issues were way, way off to the side. And as I grew older and had more time and to think about all this and to read more widely about the issues, I became quite interested. As I say, I don't think my father, looking down from heaven, would believe it if he thought I was here talking about Armenian studies and about a book that talks a lot about Armenia. Let me talk about the book for a second. There are several different things in this book. Some are reminiscences from childhood, growing up in Glendale. Secondly, there are some things about growing a little bit older. There's a chapter in my time at USC, at the Harvard Business School. There's a chapter of the 4 years that I spent in the Navy, much of that time at sea on an aircraft carrier called the Manila Bay. There's a picture in the book of the Manila Bay and of Captain Fitzhugh, our captain, and a lot of detail about some of the events that took place when we served in that ship. Then there are a couple of chapters that sort of particularly Armenian interest. One of them is about the trip in 2006 that I've already mentioned, the Nasser trip to the Republic, as well as to Historic Armenia. And secondly, there's a chapter that I called Alone Together. And the reason I called it Alone Together, it's about the whole problem of the Armenian Genocide, about the animosity between the Turkish and the Armenian peoples, the obstacles that stand in the way of any kind of reconciliation, the question of what do we mean by reconciliation? If so, how would it come about? What would be the factors? And I try to examine all of this in 15 pages or so in the book. And I'm no expert on this. Professor Dekmedjian and his people know more about this than I do. But I came to this as an Armenian who is proud of his heritage and proud of his family, looking at this situation. And if you get the book, I hope you read that chapter. What I said in that book was that I thought reconciliation would be a good thing if it can come about in an honorable way. There's no question it would be in the interest of the Republic of Turkey. The stain of blood on Turkey's record is something that increasingly Turkish people are beginning to ask about and to talk about. I want to make a distinction between individual Turkish people and the government of the Republic of Turkey itself. It is a crime in Turkey under Article 301 to mention the Armenian Genocide. Interestingly, it would be a crime in France not to mention it. So you have to kind of think about this a little bit, don't you? But there's been no systemic change. The process of denial has continued, but there's some cracks in the surface. An American author, or a British author actually, made a tour of much of Turkey and talked openly about the genocide and didn't get into any trouble. The most important book, in my opinion, is called A Shameful Act by a Turkish historian named Taner Akçam. And the phrase "a shameful act," the title of his book, those words were used by Kemal Pasha, the revered founder of the Republic of Turkey, called now Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish Republic. Kemal used that phrase in referring to the Armenian Genocide, and he used the figure of 800,000 victims, which was the officially recognized number at the time. As most of you know, the number of victims has to be an estimate, but the estimates run from a low of several thousand to a high of perhaps 1.5 million or more. But the official recognized number at the time was 800,000, and Kemal Pasha, now Kemal Ataturk, called this a shameful act and indicated that some kind of apology and explanation was required if Turkey was to remove this stain from its Ottoman past. Akçam got into trouble writing this book. He is a Turkish historian, and they wanted to put him in jail, but he was able to get out and get to Germany, and eventually came to the United States and is a professor in Worcester, Massachusetts. He spoke out here in Burbank at the Western Diocese on the occasion of Dake's memorial service. And by the way, that was an interesting moment of time. Dink was the publisher of a magazine and weekly that was published both in Armenian and Turkish, because he wanted a broad audience, and he wanted the people of Turkey to know about their past, to examine it, and to come to terms with it. When he was murdered by a young man who most likely was encouraged by ultra-nationalists, there was an outpouring, not only of grief, but of people and great processions through the city, from the office where Dink worked to the church where he was going to be memorialized. And these were Turkish people as well as Armenians and others. And they said, today we're all Dink. And so, but it didn't last very long. And at any rate, in this chapter, I say that we're coming up on 100 years since 1915. Much longer than that if you go back to the Hamidian massacres in 1895 and 96. And I might mention in passing that my grandfather, who came here and built this house south of us a few miles, and went to England in 1892, several years later, all the male members of his family were killed in the Hamidian massacres, and my grandmother's father was killed sitting peacefully on his porch smoking a pipe, and he was gunned down. So the chapter is called Alone Together, and the reason I call it that, I say in the last sentence or two, we can go alone, each espousing a position that the other side refuses to accept. Or we can try somehow or other to work together to see if there is a possibility of some sort of reconciliation that recognizes the enormity and the tragedy and the despair and the loss of identity, the loss of property, all of these things that occurred, most particularly in the 1915 genocide. It takes account of all that in some appropriate way, but lets us go forward. I myself don't think we ought to embark on a second 100 years of talking past each other. I think we and they ought to be smart enough and humane enough to find some sort of resolution. The Germans certainly were able finally to account for the Holocaust and to take account of what happened in the Nazi past, and now hold their heads high among the nations of the world. The United States has apologized to its citizens of Japanese ancestry who were put in what amounted to concentration camps in World War II. A couple of my classmates from Hoover High School were among those. I mean, Hikaru Nagawa, really nice guy, and his family and others ended up behind barbed wire. Well, we found it in our souls and in our hearts and in our pocketbooks to atone for that, to explain why it was done under wartime duress, and to apologize to these Japanese, these Americans of Japanese ancestry, and I think they got a token payment of $20,000 each. African Americans who were brought here as slaves have tried to find some sort of recompense, but we've not in the United States found a way to do that. We've officially apologized to the African American community for some experiments that were conducted at Tuskegee some time ago. The Japanese finally have come to terms with the use of Korean and other women as to service Japanese, the so-called comfort women who service Japanese troops in the Pacific War. So nations can do this, but the Turkish nation, the Republic of Turkey, somehow continues to deny the reality, the fact of what happened. I think it's bad for an individual to deny reality, and it's equally bad, maybe even worse, for a nation to do it. Tanner Achim believes the essential obstacle is that some of the same individuals who perpetrated the Armenian Genocide were also members of the new Republic of Turkey state established in the early 1920s. And Achim says in his book that we all revere our founders. We revere our Jeffersons and our Adamses and our Franklins, and so too the Turkish people revere their founders. But if they were to acknowledge the truth of what happened, it would be extremely difficult emotionally for this to happen. And so this is a book that I think sets the problem in its complexity and its immensity, but it's particularly significant because it is written by a Turkish historian who has no difficulty stating that what happened, the so-called events of 1915, as they're called by lawyers who look at this, those events constituted genocide. There's one chapter in the book that's a little bit unusual. Much of it is, there's a lot of amusing stuff about growing up and meeting some of my family's wonderful Armenian friends, doing the wash with my brother that I've already referred to. There's a chapter about cars, because you can't live and grow up in Southern California without being interested in the automobile. I mean, you could go to a drive-in and eat in an automobile, you go to church and pray in an automobile, you go to drive-in theater, at least you could in my day, and watch the movie from an automobile. So as someone said in California, you are what you drive. So there's a chapter on cars, but much of it is about my Uncle Lou, who was my father's brother. And he was a very sweet man. He drank more than he should have, but beyond that, he was really quite a nice man. He had a quality that made him the most hated man in Detroit. I mean, he's just, as I say, he's a sweet man, kind to his wife and to Carrie. Ate a lot of canned salmon, ice cream cones. A really nice man, but he was hated in Detroit. And the reason was clear. Any car Uncle Lou bought went out of business after he bought it. He bought a Haynes. Hit the desk, no more Haynes. He bought a Jordan. He bought a Romer. I mean, these were three of the, he bought something called a Nash. None of these cars are around anymore. And no matter what, if Uncle Lou bought a thing, well, there's a chapter about Uncle Lou. And also, in that chapter on cars, there's both a description and a photograph of my brother's magnificent 250 SE 1957 Mercedes convertible. It's the most magnificent hand-built, beautiful automobile that you've ever seen. That I've always coveted. He was a quite successful surgeon in Northern California. He was able to indulge himself in luxuries of this kind. And at any rate, he took his beautiful Mercedes automobile into the shop to have it worked on one day. And the man in the shop who ran it was a German named Kharpert, who had come from Frankfurt. And in the shop were other Mercedes, including the one called the Gull Wing, where the doors open up and they're worth, you know, $500. So somebody in an old Chevrolet drives into Hartmut's Mercedes place and said he thought his car was having a little trouble. And Hartmut, who still spoke with a German accent, stared at the Chevy and stared at the driver and said, "We don't work on foreign cars." Well, as I say, there's a lot in the book of amusing stuff along this line, but there's one chapter that's a little bit different, and I thought I'd put it in just because I did more in life than wash clothes with my grandfather's Sunday night. So, and it's a chapter on my boss for 7 of the 8 years I've spent in the Pentagon, Robert McNamara. McNamara is charged with the responsibility of the very, very controversial and ultimately, in many ways, tragic Vietnam War, where 58,000 Americans and countless numbers of Vietnamese people lost their lives. But I call this chapter the other McNamara because the side I worked with him on, which was the business and managerial side of the Pentagon, was a triumph in management innovation, and the changes that he made have not only become part of the lasting structure of the defense establishment, but also in the government as a whole. And so I wanted to write about that because that aspect of his career wasn't as well known, and since I had worked personally with him on a number of these issues, I thought it would be appropriate to do a chapter on that. Well, okay, those are some of the things. I'm delighted you came out. I understand there's a meeting that is maybe still in progress, or others might have been here having to do with the French government's issue about criminalizing the failure to mention the Armenian Genocide. In Turkey, you'd go to jail if you mentioned it. In France, you would if you don't mention